I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And as always, joined now by San Antonio Express News court reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Let's get right to it, Liz. We got three different cases we're going to talk about, and very quickly, we can talk about Frances Hall, who we mentioned previously a few different times on the podcast. They have dropped her bid for a new trial. Tell me about it.
Yes, it's good to be back, Chance. Frances Hall is just such a person that just garners so much interest in any type of news article that is written about her ever since she was convicted of murder in September 2016. Let's just talk a little bit about how we got to where we are today. She was convicted of murder in the death of her husband of 32 years, Bill Hall Jr. They were both 50 years old on October 10th, 2013, when Frances, her husband, and her husband's lover, Bonnie Contreras, got involved in this highway chase on South Loop 1604 in San Antonio, and Bill got knocked off of his motorcycle when he collided with her Cadillac Escalade. Both vehicles collided, and he died later that day in a hospital. Well, she was sentenced to 2 years in prison. And this was quite the whirlwind case, if you'll recall, because even though she was convicted of murder, in the punishment phase, the jurors were allowed to consider the sudden passion defense, which is something that, occurs when the person is just temporarily in a state that makes them do a certain, this certain crime. And what that did was it took her 5 to 99 year to life punishment down to a second-degree felony punishment of 2 to 20 years in prison. And the jury actually gave her 2 years in prison for killing her husband, and also found her guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon for knocking the Range Rover driven by Bonnie Contreras with her Escalade. And, it was actually Frances and Bill's Range Rover that Bonnie was driving that day when they got involved in this chase. So what had happened with this was that one of Frances's former defense attorneys on this case had felt that had his colleagues presented evidence that they did not end up presenting in court, that Frances might have been not convicted of murder. Essentially, there were issues involved with Bill Hall. He had COPD when he was knocked off of the motorcycle. It's alleged that he was not given the proper treatment that would have rendered him, to have been able to be treated. And there were other evidence that was, in play that Adam Cortez, one of Frances Hall's defense attorneys, had alleged when he filed the papers in February with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, seeking relief from her convictions based on ineffective counsel, which was what Adam had told the court. So what essentially has happened, though, is that Frances Hall is supposed to be out on September 7th, and that is a little bit more than a month from now. And her new attorney, Daniel De La Garza, told me late last week that, had this been a situation where Frances had 38 years instead of, when we spoke last week, 38 days before she was to be released from prison, he probably would have fought to the same thing that Adam Cortez attempted to do, to seek relief from her convictions. And some thought about the reason that this was wanting to occur was because there has been, since the trial, the children have been trying to wrest control of the estate away from the mother. Specifically, Justin Hall, the son, has argued that his mother shouldn't financially benefit from her criminal act. But, at the end of the day, she is supposed to be released after serving the time that the jury gave her. And her release date at this point is supposed to be September 7th. So she decided with a new attorney that she would not pursue that bid for a new trial. So it's just going to be a matter of time before Frances Hall is free again.
Yeah, and you mentioned the infighting with the family members that have survived the accident that killed her husband, which we talked about, in depth several episodes ago. You can check that out at expressnews.com/podcast. I believe you also mentioned at that time the company itself.
Right. At one point, the estate had been valued at about $7.7 million. And this is in 2014. And that was from the trucking company that both Frances Hall and Bill Hall Jr. had built together. And, but after, one could assume that after all of the litigation that has occurred, not only in the criminal and on the criminal side, but also on the civil side, that, a lot of that money has been spent. And the couple's daughter, Nikki Hall, as independent administrator, said in a court filing last year that the value of the estate, which again, I said at one point had been $7.7 million in 2014, that was the estimated value. Nikki Hall now has said in a court filing last year that the value is closer to $1.7 million. So that's definitely a huge chunk that is no longer there from that estate value just 4 years ago.
And then obviously, there might be more legal issues surrounding the company and the money itself. But at least when it comes to the death of her husband that she was convicted of, but then only ended up getting 2 years in prison, then obviously not serving the entirety of that sentence. That has come to a close, which brings us to our next story. Mark Benavides, who's someone we've spoken about many times here, a very unfortunate tale of a former public defender in Bexar County. His story is now coming to a close, at least when it comes to the charges that he has been facing.
Yes, there's actually a caveat in this, I've heard. So last week, a judge granted a motion from Bexar County prosecutors to dismiss 4 remaining sex cases against Mark Henry Benavides. He is a former San Antonio attorney who was disgraced when he was convicted in April of forcing his clients to have sex with him. And he is appealing his April conviction. Now, he was convicted on continuous trafficking of persons. And what he had pending against him was 2 charges of sexual assault of a child, 1 sexual assault charge, and another continuous trafficking of persons charge. So to remind you and listeners a little bit about this case was that Benavides, who's 48 years old, he spent a lot of time defending women who had misdemeanor and felony prostitution and drug charges. And in his April trial that was held in Wilson County, 6 women testified in just detail and along with the showing of videotapes that Benavides made of these sexual encounters. And in the trial, the women actually, and the jury and the judge, saw many of these videos, and many of these women who testified saw themselves on these videos that were played for the jury with Mark Benavides, in which he was directing what he wanted for them to do. And it was something that I did not see, and no one in the courtroom gallery were able to see these videos, but just from listening to them, they sounded just really horrible. In fact, as you'll recall, Chance, one of the highlights of that trial began on the first day in Wilson County when the very first video was shown of Benavides and one of his accusers having sex, and she is asking for him to stop because he they're having anal sex on his command, and it was so traumatizing for the jury that the judge had to call a break right after viewing that first video, and immediately as the jury began to exit the courtroom, one of the jurors passed out and eventually had to be dismissed from the jury because she said it was just too much to take. So he was convicted, and that jury sentenced him to 80 years in prison. And because of the particular charge of, continuous trafficking of persons charge, it had a 5 to 99 years or life in prison. But because of the charge, the nature of the charge, it was actually 25 years to 99 years or life. So actually the lower end of this charge, because it's a sex charge, I believe I'm getting this correct, began at 25 years. So as the defense attorneys in that case had asked for a 25-year conviction, the jury came back with 80 years. But since then, the 4 motions to dismiss documents were filed, and then they were granted last week by Senior District Judge Dick Alcala, who presided over all of the cases. Now, the only caveat here would be that depending upon what happens with the appeal. Now, if the appeals court comes back and says that Benavides was overcharged, which is some of the comments that I have heard from courthouse watchers at the Bexar County Justice Center, was that the continuous trafficking of persons charge, when the legislature passed that, wasn't really supposed to be used in this particular case. A lot of defense attorneys have argued that, and I've heard some other people in the courthouse say that they're watching this to see what happens, because it could be a game changer. Some are saying he should have just been found guilty of prostitution and been charged with a lesser charge. But the testimony from the 6 women who talked about the coercing and the forcing of sex and sex acts that happened in a motel room that's not very far from the Justice Center, and even in some of the jury and conference rooms within the Cadena Reeves Justice Center, which is where criminal courts are conducted. So it was quite the high profile case. Again, he is appealing his conviction. So, the speculation is that if he does, get a new trial, these particular cases that have just been dismissed may come back. So we'll definitely be keeping track of that.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. And then before we wrap up, Liz, we have a little bit more time left, and we can kind of go back to something that, unlike the 2 cases we've already discussed on today's program, we haven't talked about in some time, and that's Bexar County DA, Nico LaHood, who really used to be in the headlines quite often for lots of different reasons. Haven't seen his name around since he lost the primary. He won't be the DA after a certain point. And there's been a development in one of these stories that used to be making the headlines when Nico LaHood was on the front page of the San Antonio Express News.
Yes, this case is one that we haven't seen on the docket in about a year since this mistrial happened. But in 2015, there was a UTSA student by the name of Laura Carter. She was 33 years old, and she was shot 5 times in the head in the 300 block of Arid Drive on the southeast side of San Antonio on January 11th, 2015. This was a very grisly killing because the descriptions at the time that this occurred was that Laura Carter was sitting in her Honda that was still running. She had her hands in her pockets, and her legs had been crossed, kind of like she was just waiting. And the speculation is that she was indeed waiting. She was waiting to meet a heroin dealer by the name of Miguel Martinez, who is accused of shooting her. And the speculation there, and what was argued in this trial when it began with prosecutor Jason Goss, who was acting essentially as a second chair to District Attorney Nico LaHood, who was trying this case himself in the 437th State District Court, which is presided by Judge Lori Valenzuela. So in opening arguments, Jason Goss told the jury that that Laura Carter had lost her way and she had withdrawn $7,000 in cash because she was going to invest in possibly selling drugs so that she wouldn't have to work too many jobs to get her master's degree because she was in graduate school. So this particular case, it began and on February 8th of 2017. And then after about a day, the state rested after one day of testimony, and the defense had not begun to present a case. Well, at this point, there were several different machinations that were going on behind the scenes that we didn't really get to know about until afterward, when this case ended in a mistrial. And one of the reasons that occurred was that there were allegations of prosecutorial misconduct because because Jason Goss had a second chair prosecutor who, when this case landed in the district attorney's office, Jason Goss and this woman were going to be working this particular case. Well, while they were reviewing the case, the woman on this case realized that one of the key witnesses in this trial, who possibly could also at some point be a co-defendant, the woman had actually, the prosecutor had a one-night sexual encounter with. So it conflicted her participating in this case. So when Goss shared this with the other side, which they call discovery, there was a lot of back and forth as to whether or not it should have been disclosed earlier. It was disclosed too late. There were mentions of a mistrial because of it, and double jeopardy was brought up, which basically means you can't be tried twice for the same thing. And defense attorneys, in the course of many discussions that occurred in Judge Valenzuela's chambers, felt like they were being goaded into having a mistrial. Well, in one of these exchanges that occurred in Judge Valenzuela's chambers, that was not on the record, meaning it wasn't recorded by a court reporter, the attorneys got into basically things got heated in Judge Valenzuela's chambers, and the defense, which consisted of Joe Gonzalez, who is the current Democratic nominee for district attorney now, and his second chair, Christian Henrickson. They both said that Nico LaHood threatened to shut down their practices over this because they were going to allege prosecutorial misconduct. So this began a feud that began more than a year ago between Nico LaHood and Joe Gonzalez, who they had both been friends with each other. And Gonzalez actually went on to say that this particular feud is what inspired him to run for district attorney, and he ended up beating Nico LaHood in the Democratic primary. So this was quite the to-do last year. There was a hearing over it. This case ended in a mistrial, and but last week, a 3-judge panel of the Fourth Court of Appeals affirmed by 2-1 that Miguel Martinez's murder case can be retried. So this actually is a huge win from the DA's office, because they have been trying to try this case because of, the fact that Laura Carter has been dead now since January 11th, 2015. And they believe that her family deserves to have justice, and that her killers need to be taken to court, her alleged killers in this case. And in this case, that is Miguel Martinez, who is accused of killing Laura Carter. So that was a big thing. Now what happens next is that Mark Stevens, who is representing the defense attorneys in the Miguel Martinez case, said that they are going to challenge the majority decision, which, again, it was a 2-1, and the opinion was 39 pages long. And the actual dissent from one of the justices was about 34 pages long as well. And Mark Stevens says that they agree with the dissent. And with respect to the other justices, they will likely ask for a rehearing, and with the hope that the court grants that. And we'll probably find out something within 30, maybe 45 days as to whether or not this is going to go another step. But the one thing that Nico LaHood's office emphatically said last week was that they are ready to go to court in this case. And they did not, Nico LaHood did not address any of the threats or accusations that were made against him and his office last year. Instead, he and his office mostly just focused on the fact that they are ready to go to trial, and that they specifically are glad that the appeals court in this particular juncture has agreed with them.
All right. Well, it sounds like something that might come up here on the podcast again. But for today, that's going to do it for our current episode of The Docket. Of course, joining me every week is San Antonio Express News Course reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Have a great week, Liz, and we'll talk in about 7 days.
Thanks a lot, Chance. You have a great one, too.
And a big thanks to San Antonio Express News Courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me, as always, for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.